Number 10. The Feast of Fools. Some rituals are frightening because they involve blood, sacrifice, or punishment. The Feast of Fools is more unsettling for a different reason. It exposed how thin the line could be between order and chaos inside the very institutions meant to defend sacred order. In parts of medieval Europe, this festival-like inversion allowed lower-ranking clergy or participants to parody hierarchy, mock ceremony, reverse status, and temporarily turn the solemn world of religious structure into something unruly, theatrical, and almost grotesque. That is what gives the ritual its peculiar darkness. On the surface, it may look like comedy, release, or seasonal disorder. But rituals of inversion are never just jokes. They reveal what a society most fears by staging it in controlled form. The Feast of Fools did not simply laugh at authority. It created a sanctioned moment in which authority was mimicked, bent, and made unstable inside sacred space itself. Once parody enters ritual, the institution is forced to acknowledge that reverence and mockery have always lived closer together than it would like to admit. What makes the festival so memorable is its setting. This was not disorder breaking into a tavern or marketplace from outside. It was role reversal and disruptive symbolism taking shape inside the orbit of church life. Sacred offices could be imitated by those who normally stood lower in rank. Serious forms became comic. Ceremony turned sideways. The effect must have been both liberating and unnerving, because the same structure that gave meaning to the religious world was being publicly distorted while still remaining recognizably itself. That tension is what makes the Feast of Fools belong on a list like this. A society often creates controlled disorder not because it enjoys chaos, but because it fears the consequences of never releasing it. The ritual becomes a pressure valve, but a pressure valve reveals pressure. For one moment, people could watch the hierarchy wobble and discover that it was imaginable for the world to stand upside down. Even if order returned afterward, the memory of inversion would remain. The sacred had been mocked and survived, but not untouched. And that raises a deeper question. Was the festival a harmless release that ultimately protected the institution, or did it reveal a buried truth? That reverence itself depends partly on suppressing the absurd. Once you see ritual forms turned comic, you cannot fully forget how performative they are. The Feast of Fools may have ended with restoration, but restoration after parody is not the same as untouched belief. Something has been exposed. That is why authorities so often viewed such practices uneasily. Disorder can be tolerated when it remains symbolic, brief, and bounded. But ritual inversion always risks showing people that hierarchy is not natural law. It is performed, repeated, maintained. Once a fool can wear the structure for a day, the structure begins to look less eternal than it claims. That is precisely why such ceremonies are both fascinating and dangerous. They let a society approach forbidden knowledge under the mask of festivity. In the end, the Feast of Fools is unsettling not because it was the most violent ritual on this list, but because it turned sacred order into a temporary costume and let people laugh too close to the foundations of belief. For a brief moment, chaos was not outside the walls. It was invited in, dressed in holy clothing, and allowed to speak. Number 9. The Royal Touch for Healing. Some forgotten rituals look strange because they seem theatrical. The royal touch is more unsettling because it transformed political authority into something intimate, bodily, and almost miraculous. For centuries in parts of Europe, kings were believed to possess the power to heal certain illnesses, especially scrofula, through ceremonial touch. This was not just symbolism in the abstract. The sick came forward in hope. The ruler touched the afflicted body, and the act was treated as evidence that kingship itself carried sacred force. That is what makes the ritual so powerful. A crown usually rules through distance, law, spectacle, command, military force, ceremony. The royal touch reversed that distance. It brought sovereignty into contact with diseased flesh. The king was no longer only a governor of territory. He became a channel of cure. The body politic and the physical body met through ritual contact, and the legitimacy of rule was made to feel literally embodied. What gives this practice its dark fascination is how perfectly it binds belief, illness, and power together. Disease creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates hope. Hope becomes politically useful when authority offers itself as remedy. The ritual did not simply comfort the sick. It reinforced a world in which monarchy could present itself as more than administrative or hereditary. It became almost sacramental. If the king can heal, then resistance to the king begins to look not just rebellious, but spiritually disordered. That does not mean everyone involved was cynical. That is exactly what makes the ritual unsettling. Many participants likely believed deeply in what was happening. The sick sought relief. Crowds witnessed sacred kingship in action. The monarch performed a role that joined mercy, divinity, and political legitimacy into one gesture. The power of the ritual lay precisely in the fact that it could feel sincere while still strengthening the structure above it. And yet the gap between hope and result must have been enormous. Not all who were touched could have recovered. Some may have improved through time, suggestion, or coincidence, and such cases would only deepen the reputation of the rite. Others would leave disappointed, unchanged, or dying. But ritual power does not require universal success. It only requires enough belief, enough visible performance, and enough stories of apparent efficacy to keep the structure alive. A few healings, or what looked like healings, could sustain an entire theology of rule. That is why the royal touch belongs on this list. It reveals a society so invested in sacred hierarchy that illness itself became part of the theatre of legitimacy. The body of the ruler was treated as extraordinary, not only in law and lineage, but in contact. Kingship was not merely seen, it was felt on the skin. That is a far more intimate form of political mythology than most modern systems would openly attempt. In the end, the royal touch is haunting because it shows how easily suffering can be drawn into the symbolic economy of power. A sick person's hope becomes proof of divine monarchy. A ruler's hand becomes an argument. Healing, whether real, imagined, partial, or desperately interpreted, becomes inseparable from obedience and faith. The ritual asked people to believe that the kingdom's highest body could restore their own. And for a long time, enough people did. Number 8. The Celtic Wicker Man tradition. Some forgotten rituals survive in history as clear ceremonies. Others survive as a terrifying image no one can quite stop looking at. The so-called Wicker Man tradition belongs to that second category. It is one of the most enduring and unsettling ritual images attached to the ancient world. A giant figure woven from branches filled with living beings and offered to fire as sacrifice. Whether every detail later generations repeated was accurate is part of the mystery. But the image itself became so powerful because it condensed several primal fears into one structure: human offering, sacred violence, public spectacle, and the idea that a community might believe destruction was necessary to restore order. That is what gives the Wicker Man its grip on the imagination. It does not look like casual cruelty. It looks organized, built, prepared, a structure that had to be assembled in advance. That detail matters because ritual violence is always more disturbing when it is architectural. A knife kills in an instant. A giant woven figure suggests planning, symbolism, and social participation. The act is no longer just death. It becomes a ceremony in which the community turns fear, judgment, and offering into a visible monument. What makes the tradition especially haunting is the uncertainty surrounding it. Much of what later ages think they know comes through outside observers, hostile sources, and centuries of retelling that may have mixed description, accusation, and propaganda. That ambiguity should make the story weaker, but in some ways it does the opposite. A ritual that may have been exaggerated or distorted can still reveal what later societies believed ancient barbarity looked like. The wicker man becomes both a possible ritual memory and a screen for civilizational fear, and that is part of why it belongs here. Forgotten rituals are not only about what happened, they are about what later history wanted to exile from respectable memory. The wicker man was useful as an image of sacred excess, the point where religion appears to consume morality entirely. If a people could believe that burning offerings inside a human-shaped structure might appease divine forces, then ritual no longer looks like order. It looks like terror, given theological form. There is also something deeply communal about the image. A private murder is one kind of horror. A public offering is another. The wicker man suggests a society gathered around a single act of destruction and interpreting it not as crime, but as necessity. That transformation is the essence of ritual darkness. The act is not hidden because it is not felt to be shameful. It is staged because it is believed to matter. The community watches, participates, and perhaps hopes that what is surrendered will purchase survival, favor, or protection. That is why the fire matters so much. Fire purifies, destroys, transforms, and carries offerings upward in many ritual traditions. When joined to the human-shaped structure, it becomes almost unbearable in symbolic intensity. The figure resembles life, then becomes a container for death, then disappears into flame. The ritual says, in effect, that catastrophe can be controlled if enough symbolic force is concentrated into one offering. It is a terrifying expression of the human desire to negotiate with fate. In the end, the Celtic wicker man tradition belongs on this list because it represents one of history's most unforgettable visions of sacred violence. Whether literal in every detail or amplified by hostile telling, it survives because it captures the moment when ritual ceases to look merely strange and starts looking like a community trying to hold back chaos with a structure built from fear, belief, and fire. Number 7. The Japanese Hitobashira Foundation's sacrifice legend. Some forgotten rituals are disturbing because they involve public spectacle. The legend of hitobashira is darker because it moves the ritual underground. The idea is simple and horrifying, a human being buried alive or sacrificed within the foundation of a bridge, dam, castle, or other structure so that the building would stand, the waters would be calmed, or disaster would be held back. Whether every famous case attached to the tradition is historically literal is less important than the ritual logic it reveals. Stability itself was imagined as something that might require a life sealed inside the structure. That is what makes hitobashira so haunting. A building foundation is supposed to be the most practical part of architecture, the place where engineering begins. But in this legend, the foundation becomes sacrificial. Stone, wood, earth, and human life are fused together. The completed structure no longer rests only on material skill. It rests on an absorbed victim, a buried offering meant to bind the building to survival. That turns architecture into a tomb and public safety into a moral debt. What gives the ritual its peculiar force is its invisibility. A public sacrifice shocks because it's seen. A foundation sacrifice is worse in another way because it disappears into the completed world. People cross the bridge, sleep in the castle, live under the walls, and never see the life said to have been sealed beneath them. The ritual becomes permanent but hidden, absorbed into daily reality. Ordinary use continues above a concealed act of sacred violence. That hiddenness is why the legend feels so powerful in cultural memory. Hitobashira suggests that order may depend on something no one wants to look at directly. The structure stands, and therefore the sacrifice can be imagined as effective. Every year the bridge remains unbroken, every flood the wall resists, every castle that endures a storm seems to justify the fear that perhaps some offerings really do stabilize the world. It is a ritual logic born from uncertainty. If nature, war, and collapse threaten what we build, then maybe a life given at the base can persuade fate to spare the rest. There is also a terrible intimacy to the legend. A battlefield death belongs to war. A judicial execution belongs to punishment. But being chosen or imagined as chosen to become part of a foundation means being transformed into infrastructure. The person ceases to belong fully to themselves or even to memory. They become support. That is one of the darkest ritual ideas on this list. The victim is not merely killed for the gods. The victim is incorporated into the lasting body of the community's need. And because the tradition survives partly through story, ballad, and local memory, it sits in that eerie space between documented practice and moral truth. Even where literal evidence is uncertain, the persistence of the legend tells us something important. It tells us that people found the idea believable. They understood the emotional grammar of such a sacrifice. In dangerous landscapes and uncertain times, the difference between engineering and appeasement could become thinner than modern minds like to admit. That is why hitobashira belongs here. It reveals a worldview in which building was not always just technical. It could also be sacrificial, haunted by the suspicion that walls and bridges demand more than labor. They demand life. And once that belief enters a culture, every old structure begins to feel slightly less inert. Stone may be holding because something human was once asked to hold with it. In the end, the legend of hitobashira is unsettling because it takes one of civilization's proudest acts, building something meant to last, and attaches to it the possibility that permanence was purchased with a hidden body. The structure survives, the offering disappears, and history is left wondering how many foundations were imagined as secure only because someone, somewhere, thought they had fed the earth first. Number 6. Ettore Majorana. Some disappearances become mysteries because the missing person walked into danger. Ettore Majorana is more unsettling because he seemed to step out of history while standing at the center of one of the most dangerous intellectual revolutions of the modern age. He was not an explorer, a fugitive celebrity, or a politician entangled in obvious public scandal. He was a brilliant physicist, widely regarded as one of the most gifted minds of his generation, moving in the orbit of theoretical breakthroughs that would soon reshape the world. When a man like that vanishes, the question is never only where he went. It is what he understood before he chose, or was forced, to disappear. That is what gives the case its unusual depth. Majorana disappeared in 1938 after a series of confusing letters and movements that seemed to suggest both finality and hesitation. There were hints of suicide, then indications that he may have changed his mind, then silence. The ambiguity arrived almost immediately. His last known actions did not form a clean line toward one obvious conclusion. Instead, they created a pattern of partial signals, as though the disappearance itself had been staged in fragments, enough to imply an ending, but not enough to fix one. What makes this especially haunting is Majorana's intellectual position. He belonged to a world in which physics was moving toward profound and morally unsettling possibilities. Even if his disappearance cannot be reduced to some simple story about scientific guilt or prophetic fear, that context matters because it changes how later generations read the case. Was he overwhelmed by personal crisis? Did he reject the world around him? Did he choose monastic withdrawal, hidden life, or self-erasure? Or did he sense more clearly than others the kind of future his field was making possible and refused to continue inside it? The temptation to connect genius with disappearance is strong because the silence feels too large to be merely ordinary. And yet the real power of the mystery lies in how human it remains beneath the legend. Letters, reservations, reported sightings, family anguish, institutional response. These details ground the case in the painful ordinary mechanics of loss. He was not transformed into myth by some dramatic public event. He became myth because the ordinary channels through which a life should remain traceable suddenly failed. That failure is especially disturbing in the case of someone so mentally precise. A physicist's disappearance feels like a contradiction. The man dedicated to invisible structures left behind an absence no one could resolve. That is why Majorana's case keeps drawing theories of voluntary disappearance. The alternative, a sudden accidental end or unplanned self-destruction, never fully satisfies people because his final traces seem too composed, too suggestive, too strangely arranged. A brilliant mind leaving partial messages creates a uniquely durable kind of mystery. It implies intention without revealing destination. And once intention is suspected, every monastery, every foreign sighting, every rumor of hidden survival starts seeming just plausible enough to live on. There is also something chilling about how well disappearance fits certain fantasies of genius. Society likes to imagine that truly exceptional minds might reject ordinary life completely, slipping away into solitude, secrecy, or some hidden moral withdrawal from history. Majorana's case invites that fantasy while never proving it. The result is a disappearance that feels intellectually charged even when the underlying truth may have been simpler and sadder. The mystery does not just ask where he went. It asks what kind of person can step out of the world so completely that even genius becomes only another layer of uncertainty. In the end, Ettore Majorana belongs on this list because his disappearance left behind one of history's most unnerving combinations: great intelligence, ambiguous final gestures, and total unresolved absence. He vanished at the edge of a century obsessed with scientific power, and the silence around him has never stopped inviting the suspicion that his disappearance meant more than simple loss. Whether it did or not, history can no longer prove. That is exactly why the case remains alive. Number 5. Amelia Earhart. Some disappearances become famous because they seem impossible in practical terms. Amelia Earhart's became something larger because her disappearance struck at the heart of modern confidence itself. She was one of the most celebrated aviators in the world, a symbol of daring, technical mastery, public courage, and the idea that the sky was no longer an unknowable frontier. When someone like that disappears during a flight meant to demonstrate exactly how far modern skill and technology could go, the result is not just a mystery, it is a wound in the mythology of progress. That is what gives Earhart's case its enduring power. She was not only a pilot, she was a public figure carrying the emotional weight of an era that wanted heroes of motion, machines, and transcendence. Her attempt to fly around the world was already larger than an individual journey. It belonged to a narrative of modernity, pushing outward and upward. So when contact was lost and no universally accepted final explanation emerged, the disappearance instantly became more than an aviation problem. It became a question about the limits of human reach. The basic facts seemed simple enough at first. Earhart and navigator Fred Noonan vanished during the later stages of the around-the-world flight, somewhere in the vast Pacific, near the point where navigation, communication, weather, and fuel margin all become terrifyingly unforgiving. That setting matters enormously. The ocean does not only hide bodies, it destroys sequence. A city disappearance leaves clues people can revisit. A disappearance over sea turns space itself into an accomplice. Searchers can move through enormous emptiness and still never reach certainty. That is why the case generated so many competing theories. Crash and sink remains the most straightforward explanation, and in many ways the most persuasive. But the absence of definitive wreckage for so long helped keep other possibilities alive. Forced landing, survival on a remote island, capture, hidden identity, covert mission, or a final chapter history has not yet fully recovered. Each theory survives because the Pacific is large enough to preserve doubt. The missing plane became a perfect container for historical imagination. What makes Earhart especially haunting is the tension between visibility and disappearance. She was one of the most watched women in the world, yet in the end she was swallowed by a space so immense that celebrity became irrelevant. Public attention, fame, and national resources all failed before distance and uncertainty. That contrast gives the story a peculiarly modern sadness. The very culture that elevated her into symbolic visibility could not rescue her from becoming one of the 20th century's most famous absences. There is also a deeper emotional layer in the case. Earhart did not vanish in retreat, secrecy, or scandal. She vanished while moving forward, attempting something bold and technically demanding. That matters because it changes the moral texture of the story. This is not a disappearance that feels like concealment. It feels like interruption. History cutting a life off at the exact moment it seemed to be extending its reach. The mystery lives partly because the narrative arc feels unfinished in a way people still resist accepting. And because Earhart became such a symbolic figure, the disappearance never belonged only to aviation experts. It entered public culture as a permanent question mark. Maps, radio signals, navigation errors, fragments, reefs, transmissions, sightings, every clue becomes emotionally significant because the case is attached not only to a missing plane, but to a missing icon. People are not simply searching for wreckage. They are searching for the final sentence in a story modernity expected to end differently. In the end, Amelia Earhart belongs at number 5 because her disappearance captures the full force of historical absence. Vast geography, failed certainty, unresolved evidence, and a figure too important to vanish comfortably. The sky promised expansion, achievement, and proof that human beings could master distance. Then one of its greatest public representatives disappeared into that distance and left the century asking the same question ever since. What exactly happened out there where the world opened too wide to answer back? Number 4. The Viking blood eagle tradition. Some forgotten rituals survive as clear practices. Others survive as one of history's most infamous and disputed images of sacred violence. The blood eagle belongs to that second category. It is remembered as a punishment or sacrificial execution in which the victim's back was opened and the body transformed into a grotesque symbolic display. Whether every later retelling is accurate, exaggerated, or shaped by hostile imagination is part of the mystery. But that uncertainty does not weaken its power. It strengthens it, because the blood eagle survives both as a possible ritual act and as a cultural image of what happens when honor, vengeance, and symbolism become inseparable from bodily destruction. That is what makes it so haunting. The blood eagle is not frightening merely because it implies death. It is frightening because it makes death theatrical. The body does not simply cease. It is arranged, opened, converted into message, and that conversion matters. Ritual violence always becomes darker when it is not only meant to kill, but to signify. The blood eagle, as remembered, transforms the victim into proof of dominance, vengeance, sacred seriousness, or a world in which suffering can still be made to speak after the person no longer can. What gives the tradition its peculiar place in historical imagination is its connection to honor culture and revenge. In that framework, violence is rarely private. It is relational, symbolic, and often public. The injury done to the body answers another injury, restores an imbalance, or projects a warning outward. If the blood eagle existed in anything like the form later sources suggest, then it would represent one of the starkest examples of a society turning retribution into ritual display. The killer is not only ending life, the killer is writing hierarchy onto flesh, and that is where the ritual becomes more than a gruesome story. It reveals something about the desire to make punishment unforgettable. Many cultures kill. Fewer create an image that remains horrifying centuries later, precisely because it joins execution with symbolism so tightly. The body becomes almost architectural in the act, no longer treated simply as human remains but as a shaped site of meaning. That is why the blood eagle, real or embellished, continues to disturb. It presents violence not as chaos, but as controlled revelation. The uncertainty around the tradition also matters. Scholars debate whether it was literal, poetic, misunderstood, or selectively dramatized in later texts. But even if some accounts intensified its horror, that too tells us something important. Later generations found this image believable enough to preserve. They recognized in it a possible truth about how sacred violence, warrior prestige, and punitive imagination could converge. A ritual does not need perfect historical documentation to reveal the fears and fascinations that made it memorable. There is also something especially chilling about how well the blood eagle fits the logic of ritualized vengeance. Ordinary execution ends a life. Ritual execution claims to do more. It converts death into cosmic or social language. It says the victim is not simply dead, but meaningfully dead, placed into a form others must read. That difference is what makes sacred or symbolic violence so much harder to absorb morally. It seeks not only compliance, but awe. In the end, the Viking blood eagle belongs on this list because it stands at the point where ritual, punishment, and myth begin feeding each other. Whether fully historical in every detail or not, it survives as one of the clearest examples of a forgotten practice history both cannot confirm comfortably and cannot stop imagining. The body in this tradition is not only destroyed, it is turned into an emblem of a world where pain itself could be made ceremonial. Number 3. The Pharmakos scapegoat ritual of ancient Greece. Some forgotten rituals are dark because they involve kings, warriors, or victims chosen for spectacle. The Pharmakos ritual is more unsettling because it exposes one of the oldest and most durable structures in human culture. The belief that a community can cleanse itself by loading its fear, guilt, disorder, or pollution onto another human being and pushing that person out. In ancient Greek tradition, the Pharmakos was a scapegoat figure, sometimes beaten, humiliated, expelled, or otherwise used in a ritual of communal purification, especially in times of plague, famine, or crisis. That is what gives the ritual its frightening clarity. A society under pressure wants explanation. It wants relief. It wants a visible mechanism through which bad fortune can be removed. The Pharmakos provides exactly that. Instead of sitting helpless before disease or disaster, the community performs a transfer. Misfortune is treated as something that can be gathered up, symbolically attached to a body and driven away. In that sense, the ritual is not only about cruelty, it is about the desperate human desire to make catastrophe manageable by giving it a target. What makes this especially dark is how morally efficient the structure is. The community does not have to solve the deeper cause of its suffering. It only has to identify a carrier. Once the scapegoat is chosen, complexity collapses into action. Pollution, guilt, divine anger, social tension, and communal fear can all be condensed into one body standing at the edge of belonging. The ritual then does what rituals do best. It turns abstraction into visible movement. The scapegoat is marked, handled, expelled, and the community feels that something intolerable has finally been made to leave. That is why the Pharmakos belongs so high on this list. It reveals a terrifying truth not only about ancient Greece, but about human communities more broadly. We are often most dangerous when we are suffering together and cannot bear the idea that suffering might be random, structural, or unresolved. The scapegoat ritual offers a simple answer. Someone will carry it for us. Someone will become the shape of what we want gone. And because the ritual is framed as purification, the violence acquires moral cover. The victim is not simply mistreated. The victim is used in service of the common good. That is one of the darkest transformations ritual can perform. It makes exclusion feel sacred. It allows cruelty to be interpreted as restoration. The community does not see itself as producing injustice. It sees itself as surviving. There is also something especially haunting about the status of the scapegoat figure. The chosen person often stands close to the boundary of the social body already, marginal enough to be used, human enough to matter symbolically, vulnerable enough to receive what the rest want removed. That makes the ritual more than a response to crisis. It becomes a map of who can be sacrificed without threatening the illusion of communal innocence. The Pharmakos is not outside society by accident. Society needs someone near enough to absorb its fear and far enough to be cast away, And perhaps that is why the ritual still feels so disturbingly modern in structure, even if its ancient forms are distant. The details belong to another age, but the psychological mechanism is painfully familiar. A crisis rises. A community panics. Purity becomes the goal. One figure is loaded with blame. Removal begins to look like healing. The Pharmakos ritual preserves that mechanism in one of its oldest ceremonial forms. In the end, the Pharmakos belongs at number 3 because it captures the moral heart of so many forgotten rites. The belief that order can be restored if another human being is made to carry what the community refuses to keep inside itself. It is a purification ritual, yes, but it is also a ritualized confession of fear. The society cannot control catastrophe, so it performs control through expulsion and calls the result cleansing. Number 2, the Aztec New Fire Ceremony. Some forgotten rituals are frightening because they punish a victim. The Aztec New Fire Ceremony is more unsettling because it was designed to hold back cosmic collapse itself. This was not a local rite for one village, one king, or one crisis. It was tied to the terrifying possibility that the world might simply fail to continue. At the end of a major calendrical cycle, the ceremony confronted a question larger than politics or harvest. Would the sun rise again, or had time itself reached the point where order could break? That is what gives the ritual its extraordinary power. The New Fire Ceremony did not treat catastrophe as metaphor. It treated it as a real possibility requiring exact ceremonial response. Fires across the land were extinguished, darkness spread, households waited, communities entered a suspended state in which ordinary continuity stopped being taken for granted. The ritual said, in effect, that the world does not keep going automatically. It must be renewed, and renewal may require an offering severe enough to speak to the cosmos. What makes this especially haunting is the scale of emotional exposure built into it. A sacrifice can be terrifying in isolation, but a ceremony that places an entire society inside ritual darkness, asking whether dawn itself will return, creates a deeper form of dread. The community is not merely watching a sacred act. It is living through a moment in which the future seems conditional. That condition transforms every part of the ritual into amplified meaning. Fire is no longer domestic or useful. It becomes cosmic permission for life to continue. And because the rite is tied to celestial cycles, it reveals one of the darkest truths about ritual thinking. Human beings often try to negotiate with forces far larger than themselves by concentrating fear into one formal act. The New Fire Ceremony was not random violence. It was disciplined cosmology. The sacrifice, the extinguishing of flames, the waiting in darkness, the relighting, these were parts of a system meant to restore the bond between human society and the unstable order of the universe. That is precisely why it is so unsettling. It treats existence itself as precarious and blood as part of what keeps the heavens from closing. There is also something unforgettable about the symbolism of the new flame. Fire is one of the oldest images of life, continuity, home, divine presence, and civilization. To extinguish it everywhere and then reignite it through ceremony is to stage the death and rebirth of the world in miniature. The ritual does not merely ask for belief. It generates an experience of dependence. A society waits in darkness, then receives light back through sacred action. Once lived that way, power, religious, cosmic, political, becomes almost impossible to separate. That is why the New Fire Ceremony belongs this high on the list. It shows ritual at its most total. The rite does not just address guilt, kingship, or illness. It addresses time itself. It imagines that human survival depends on correctly managing the transition between one cycle and the next. The gods are not distant abstractions. They are conditions of sunrise. Under that belief, sacrifice is no longer just sacrifice. It becomes maintenance of the universe. In the end, the Aztec New Fire Ceremony is haunting because it captures a civilizational fear most people usually keep hidden. the fear that the world may stop unless something is done. History tried to leave such rites behind because they reveal how extreme the human response to cosmic uncertainty can become. But the ritual endures in memory because it asks one of the oldest and darkest questions of all. What if order does not continue on its own, and what would we offer to make sure it does? Number 1. The Roman October horse sacrifice. Some forgotten rituals survive because they look bizarre from a distance. The October horse stands at number 1 because it combines nearly everything that makes ancient ritual disturbing: blood, state power, sacred competition, agricultural anxiety, martial symbolism, and the eerie certainty that one carefully chosen death could transfer force to the entire community. In ancient Rome, a horse associated with a victorious chariot team was sacrificed in October, and what followed was not simple disposal. The body, blood, and contested remains entered a ritual economy so intense that the act feels less like one ceremony than a whole concentrated worldview. That is what makes the October horse so powerful. A horse in Roman culture was never just an animal. It carried military prestige, speed, status, and sacrificial potential. To kill such an animal publicly at a specific calendrical moment was to bring together war and fertility, victory and harvest, civic identity and divine negotiation. The offering was not marginal to society. It was woven into the symbolic center of how Rome understood strength and continuity. What deepens the unease is the treatment of the remains. The head became an object of contest. The tail was rushed for ritual use. Blood itself mattered. This was not a simple slaughter completed at the altar and forgotten. The sacrificed body continued acting inside the ceremony after death, as if different parts of it carried different charges needed by the city. That fragmentation is one of the darkest features of many ancient rites. The victim is not only killed, the victim is redistributed into meaning, and because this was Rome, the ritual feels especially revealing. We often remember Rome through law, roads, empire, armies, engineering, and political ambition. The October horse reminds us that beneath all that administrative strength stood a world still deeply bound to sacrificial logic. Even the most disciplined state can preserve rites that look primitive only if we forget what they were trying to accomplish. For Rome, these acts were not irrational leftovers. They were structured ways of binding military energy, seasonal transition, and civic protection together in one sacred transaction. That is why the ritual is more unsettling than it first appears. The horse is not merely offered to a god in generic reverence. It is selected from a charged context of competition and motion, then converted into sacrificial potency for the city. Violence here is not chaotic. It is distilled. Rome is taking force from one of its own most symbolically powerful animals and rooting that force into communal preservation. It is ritualized state appetite in one of its clearest forms. There is also something profoundly Roman about the tension between control and savagery in the ceremony. Everything is formalized, timed, publicly meaningful, yet the substance of the act remains archaic and visceral. Blood, speed, body parts, contest, sacred utility. The state appears orderly, but its order is still fed by rites close to the oldest human instincts about sacrifice and power. That combination is precisely why the October horse lingers so strongly. It reveals civilization not as the opposite of sacrificial violence, but as one of its most efficient organizers. And unlike some rituals whose meaning depends on private mystery, the October horse feels civic. It belongs to the city. The sacrifice is not happening at the edge of social life. It is happening near the center of Roman identity. That makes it darker. The whole community is implicated not by accident, but by design. Rome is not hiding the ritual from itself. It is performing the act as part of how it imagines seasonal order, divine favor, and collective strength. In the end, the Roman October horse stands at number 1 because it captures the deepest truth running beneath this entire video. The strangest and darkest rituals are often not random at all. They are the ones a civilization builds closest to its own foundations, where war, fertility, fear, and sacred order become impossible to separate. The October horse is not just memorable because it is violent. It is memorable because it reveals how a great power could look at blood and symbol and still believe it was doing exactly what was necessary to keep the world in balance.